For decades, the Middle East was dominated by the United States and Western powers. Washington shaped wars, controlled alliances, protected oil routes, and influenced almost every major political crisis in the region. But that is now changing. China is expanding influence across the Middle East very quickly. Not through invasions or military coalitions, but through trade, infrastructure, energy deals, and diplomacy. And now Beijing is becoming one of the most important geopolitical players in the region. Here's how China is building influence across the Middle East, and why this shift could reshape global power in the 21st century. China's rise depends heavily on energy. As the world's largest manufacturing economy, China needs massive amounts of oil and gas to keep its industries running, and much of that energy comes directly from the Middle East. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and the UAE have become strategically critical for Beijing because the Gulf region holds some of the world's largest oil reserves. China understands something very clearly. If energy supplies from the Middle East become unstable, China's economy also becomes vulnerable. That is why Beijing is investing so aggressively across the region. China's strategy in the Middle East looks very different from the American approach. The United States built military bases, security alliances, and large military operations across the region. China is building ports, railways, industrial zones, trade corridors, and technology networks. Beijing is using economic influence instead of military intervention. This strategy is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, a massive global project designed to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure and trade. And the Middle East sits directly at the center of that system. China is investing in ports in the UAE, industrial zones in Egypt, technology projects in Saudi Arabia, and transportation infrastructure across the region. Beijing is slowly turning economic influence into geopolitical influence. One of China's biggest advantages in the Middle East is flexibility. The United States often chooses sides in regional conflicts. China tries to maintain relations with everyone at the same time. Beijing has strong ties with Saudi Arabia and Iran simultaneously. It also continues expanding partnerships with the UAE, Egypt, Turkey, and other regional powers. Even countries that compete against each other continue working closely with China. That gives Beijing growing diplomatic space across the Middle East. And unlike Western governments, China usually avoids criticizing domestic politics, governance issues, or human rights policies. Many Middle Eastern governments see that approach as less threatening and far more predictable. China is now moving beyond trade and infrastructure projects. Beijing is also becoming more active diplomatically. The biggest example came when China helped mediate the diplomatic rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023. That was a major geopolitical moment. For years, the United States dominated Middle East diplomacy, but China showed that it could also bring major regional rivals to the negotiating table. That significantly increased Beijing's political influence across the region. China is now presenting itself as a neutral mediator that prioritizes stability, economic cooperation, and dialogue, instead of military confrontation. But China's rise in the Middle East also comes with serious risks. The region remains highly unstable. Wars and conflicts continue in Gaza, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. That threatens Chinese investments, trade routes, infrastructure projects, and long-term economic plans. At the same time, China is entering direct strategic competition with the United States. Washington still maintains massive military power and political influence across the region. And American policymakers increasingly see China's growing presence as a direct geopolitical challenge. China also faces another difficult problem. Beijing must maintain good relations with rival powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran without becoming trapped inside regional conflicts. That requires extremely careful diplomacy. China's rise in the Middle East reflects a much bigger global transformation. The world is no longer dominated by one superpower alone. Power is now spreading across multiple centers, and China is using trade, infrastructure, technology, investment, and energy diplomacy to expand influence globally. Beijing understands that modern power is not built only through military force. Economic control can also reshape geopolitics, and the Middle East is becoming one of the main arenas where this new global competition is unfolding. China is no longer just a distant economic actor in the Middle East. Beijing is becoming a major geopolitical force across the region through energy partnerships, infrastructure projects, trade, diplomacy, and strategic investment. The United States still remains the dominant military power in the Middle East, but China is building influence in a very different way, slowly, economically, and strategically. And as competition between Washington and Beijing continues growing, the Middle East may become one of the most important battlegrounds shaping the future global order. For more geopolitical and global power analysis, subscribe to Indo-Pacific Report Global. And stay informed.